Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is part 2, American Civil War in the Border States, Rise of Grant. I was just confused why Harris was protesting to the Confederates, unless he's wanting more troops, because he's got the Confederate flag behind him. So my only thought is he's I don't know. I can understand he was protesting because he wanted to remain neutral, and now he has both of them there. Harris has to be protesting. Maybe Harris is protesting his protest and just wants to take the state. I have no idea. Before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up, just like that, bare minimum. Subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Click on the thanks if you want to keep the channel running. All right, let's find out.
Davis and Department Commander General Albert Johnston protested to Richmond. Davis had promised Magoffin and Harris only days before that the Confederacy would never violate Kentucky's neutrality. However, Davis accepted Polk's claims that the necessity justified the action, to Johnston's horror. Instead of defending a narrow line along Tennessee's western border, he now had to hold a line from Columbus through Bowling Green to the Cumberland Gap. If the Federals found any gap in that line, Kentucky, and with it Nashville, were indefensible. Polk's impetuousness was a strategic disaster, especially once the pro-Union Assembly overrode Magoffin's vetoes and welcomed Union intervention. Meanwhile, Price had failed to retake Missouri. Despite being unopposed thanks to chaos and inefficiency in Fremont's headquarters, Price's northern march was lethargic at best. His only real success was capturing Lexington after a week-long siege. In July, the Constitutional Convention reconvened in Jefferson City and declared itself Missouri's government, as Jackson's government had effectively vacated their posts. While the legislature had reconvened in Neosho, it was powerless, and many legislators were abandoning Jackson. Worse, Fremont finally advanced out of St. Louis on September 26th with overwhelming numbers, and Price rapidly retreated south, abandoning all his summer gains. Shortly before fleeing Missouri, Jackson's government voted for secession on October 28th, despite not having that power and likely lacking a quorum, which was necessary for legal legitimacy. However, Davis ignored the legal questions and added Missouri's star to the Confederate flag. Meanwhile, pro-secession Kentucky politicians met in Bowling Green and declared Kentucky's succession and themselves as its government on November 18th. The move was so clearly illegitimate that Johnston didn't acknowledge them until Davis ordered him to, so the Confederate flag could add a 13th star. Both border states' populations largely ignored the secession declarations, but in truth, their fate would be decided by military force in their southern neighbors. Johnston was increasingly convinced that Kentucky was already lost, as Don Carlos Buell's growing army in Lexington alone outnumbered his department. Worse, his subordinates were liabilities. Polk only reluctantly followed orders and quarreled about everything, but couldn't be removed due to his political connections. Several of Davis's other political generals lost battles to Colonel James Garfield and Brigadier George Thomas in eastern Kentucky. Confederate Kentucky was already crumbling. In the Union camp, Lincoln removed Fremont from department command and replaced him with Henry Halleck in October. Officially, Fremont was removed for severe financial mismanagement, indistinguishable from rampant corruption. Unofficially, Fremont needed punishing to placate pro-slavery Unionists. Halleck was an able administrator and scholar who quickly fixed Fremont's mess. However, per orders from General-in-Chief George McClellan, he held off on offensive action until all commands were ready. However, Grant and Flag Officer Andrew Foote of the Western Gunboat Flotilla convinced him that Fort Henry was vulnerable and were allowed to attack in February. The plan was for Grant's 2 divisions to surround Fort Henry, while Foote covered them. However, it had been constructed in the Tennessee River's floodplain and was half under water when Foote arrived with 4 city-class ironclads and 3 timber-clad gunboats on February 6th. Most of the garrison retreated to nearby Fort Donelson, leaving a token force to man the guns, who surrendered after a 75-minute bombardment. Grant occupied the fort a few hours later. When word reached Johnston, he knew Kentucky was lost. With Federals behind and in front of him, he'd be trapped in Bowling Green if either advanced. Therefore, he ordered a retreat to Nashville before the trap closed. Fort Donelson was heavily reinforced. If it fell, Nashville was also lost. Grant intended to move against Donelson immediately in case Halleck recalled him, but heavy rains submerged Henry and made the roads impassable. Instead, Foote launched a raid down the Tennessee, while Grant waited for reinforcements and better weather. Fort Donelson sat above the Cumberland on cliffs and was protected by about 16,000 infantry and 700 cavalry. However, the senior officer was Brigadier General John Floyd, whose only military experience was as James Buchanan's Secretary of War. Having no idea what he was doing, Floyd largely deferred to Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, who had demonstrated military mediocrity in Mexico. The only competent officers were the junior Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner and Cavalry Colonel Nathan Forrest. Grant finally started moving on February 12th with 15,000 men. Forrest detected the march and warned Floyd. The Confederates were spread in a
All right, sorry, I had to try to fix this glitch. Then I turned the microphone on.
wide ring of trenches outside the fort as Grant arrived. Grant placed his largest division to block Pillow's troops in Dover, while his other division faced the fort. Some light skirmishing broke out on the 13th, and Foote tested the defenses with one ship. Grant was waiting for Foote and additional reinforcements to arrive, while Floyd didn't know what to do and didn't know what advice to listen to. On February 14th, Foote arrived with 10,000 reinforcements, bringing Grant's strength to 25,000. Floyd finally called a war council at 1100 and concluded that Fort Donelson wasn't defensible. Pillow was ordered to prepare a breakout before evacuating to Nashville. However, the attack faltered when Pillow lost his nerve once Grant counterattacked. Sensing the rebels' fear, Grant asked Foote to attack, hoping to repeat Fort Henry. Foote engaged at 1500, but his gunboat's decks were unarmored and helpless against plunging fire from the fort, and a wounded Foote retreated at 1630. That night, Grant decided to prepare a proper siege, while Buckner advised another breakout attempt. Freezing rain kept Grant's troops awake, so the dawn attack didn't surprise them. However, Grant had left to confer with Foote, thinking another breakout was impossible, and hadn't designated a second in command. A flank attack by Forrest's troopers, combined with a frontal attack by Pillow's infantry, pushed back the Union flank along Lick Creek. However, confusion reigned in the Confederate camp, and the attacks were uncoordinated, as the generals argued amongst themselves. Still, by 1230, the escape route was open. Grant learned of the situation around 1200, after asking Foote to launch a long-range bombardment to confuse the Confederates and encourage his men. He arrived on the scene shortly after Confederate attacks petered out. Correctly surmising that they were preparing to retreat, he reorganized his troops to counterattack, only for Pillow to withdraw back to his starting positions. He believed that his men needed to rest and resupply before attempting the escape, to Floyd and Buckner's horror. This enabled Grant's counterattack to regain all the lost ground and pin them more tightly into the fort, preventing escape. During the night, the Confederates...
The one thing about Grant is he had such an ability to read what you were doing against him and to pretty accurately predict it. He also knew some of the people from the Mexican-American War, from West Point, and he could play out how they fought, things that they would do, their techniques. And he was able to really pick apart your strengths and your weaknesses. And so he knew they were going to retreat. So when he sees them fall back, he gets in tighter, gets his line in tighter to not allow them to try to do any of that. And it was just a masterful way he could read people. It's so impressive.
concluded that their position was hopeless. Fearing federal retribution, Floyd passed command to Pillow, who passed command to Buckner. Pillow escaped during the night on a rowboat, while Floyd loaded his staff and Virginia regiments into the last steamer and fled to Nashville, while Buckner agreed to surrender the remaining 13,000 troops. However, Forrest and his cavalry escaped through a gap in the Union lines. Buckner and Grant were West Point friends, and Buckner hoped that would yield generous surrender terms. However, Grant would only offer unconditional surrender, which Buckner begrudgingly accepted. Fort Donelson was the first major Union land victory, and the nation was euphoric. Grant was hailed as a hero for demanding unconditional surrender, just like his first initials. Lincoln took notice and promoted him to Major General. Johnston evacuated Nashville for Corinth, Mississippi. Meanwhile, overwhelming federal numbers in Missouri forced Price to withdraw towards Arkansas continually. In December, Halleck tasked Brigadier Samuel Curtis's Army of the Southwest with finishing him off. Price retreated into Arkansas to avoid being trapped in Springfield in February, leaving a handful of scattered state guard and bushwhacker companies as the only Confederate presence in Missouri. Curtis almost caught Price in a series of skirmishes along the Wire Road before Price reached the Boston Mountains, but stretched supply lines compelled Curtis to rest his 10,500 soldiers along Little Sugar Creek. Price linked back up.
Little Sugar Creek sounds like a delicious place to retreat to. Probably not, but...
with McCulloch near Fayetteville, and they immediately resumed their bickering. To stop them, Davis created the Trans-Mississippi Department, placing Earl Van Dorn in charge. Van Dorn arrived in late February, taking command of 15,000 Confederate and State Guard troops, plus 800 mostly Cherokee Indian cavalry. The tribes of the Indian Territory had little love for the Federals, and many were slaveholders, making them allies of the Confederacy. Van Dorn decided to attack and trap the outnumbered Curtis. Audaciously, he planned to swing around Curtis and cut his supply and communication lines before attacking his rear. Speed was key to the operation, so Van Dorn separated from his supply train and ordered his soldiers to carry only 40 rounds of ammunition, 3 days' rations, and a blanket. The forced march began in freezing rain on March 4th. Curtis learned of Van Dorn's advance on March 5th. His divisions were out foraging when orders came to reconcentrate. About 400 men were too far west to return, and Sigel returned from Bentonville so slowly that he and his rearguard should have been captured March 6th, but the Confederate cavalry took the wrong road and missed their chance. Curtis placed his 4 divisions on the bluffs north of Little Sugar Creek, expecting Van Dorn to attack from the south. Additionally, trees were felled along the Bentonville detour as a precaution. This was fortunate, as the detour along Pease Ridge Plateau was Van Dorn's route to Curtis's rear at Elkhorn Tavern. The obstructions plus exhaustion prevented him from reaching Elkhorn by daylight on March 7th. To speed up the march, he split the army. He and Price would continue on the detour, while McCulloch used Ford Road to reach Elkhorn. Federal patrols noticed the Confederates on the detour, but didn't know if it was the main body. Curtis dispatched Dodge's brigade to Elkhorn and Osterhaus's brigade to Leetown to reconnoiter. First contact came at 0930, when Price's vanguard encountered Union scouts north of Elkhorn. The rest of Carr's division hurried to support Dodge, but rather than use his numerical advantage, Van Dorn waited to deploy in a line fully. Carr sent his advance brigade forward, and the counterattack temporarily halted Price's advance. However, Price's superior numbers let him outflank Carr, who blocked the effort with his remaining brigades but was steadily pushed back. At 11:30, Osterhaus discovered McCulloch's troops nearing his position. His cavalry company immediately attacked to stall McCulloch, and Osterhaus warned Curtis, who dispatched Colonel Jefferson C. Davis's division. The Federal cavalry was scattered by 3,000 Confederate cavalry, and the Cherokee overran several infantry companies before being routed by artillery fire. McCulloch was killed by a Union sharpshooter as he led the infantry attack. His replacement was killed shortly thereafter, and his replacement was captured as the attack faltered amid the command confusion. Davis arrived and halted the attack, which caused the confused Confederates to collapse at 15:30. Some units retreated east to link up with Van Dorn and Price. Others retreated the way they came, and a few were left behind and kept fighting until nightfall. Van Dorn learned about the fighting in Leetown around 1400. Realizing that the rendezvous wouldn't happen, he ordered more aggressive attacks on Carr's division. Curtis and his 2nd Division arrived and helped Carr hold Price in Roddick's Field at 18:30. During the night, parts of McCulloch's division linked up with Van Dorn. The supply train was supposed to arrive too, having travelled by another road, but it went to the wrong location. Nearly out of ammunition and food, Van Dorn hoped that Curtis would retreat in the morning, letting him claim victory. Instead, Curtis concentrated his forces south of Elkhorn and attacked, with Sigel's unengaged division leading. The Confederates were in headlong retreat by 1100. Curtis reported 1,384 casualties, while Van Dorn suffered around 2,000, while claiming he wasn't defeated but failed in his intentions. Regardless, he was ordered to abandon both Missouri and northern Arkansas and cross the Mississippi to help defend Corinth. Many of Price's state guard deserted, and no serious effort was made to retake Missouri until 1864. The border states had been secured for the Union. In our next video in this series, the Confederacy will try to retake the initiative in the Western Theater. To make sure you don't miss that, please subscribe and press the bell button.
I didn't talk a whole lot because a lot of the Missouri fighting and then the early Kentucky, Tennessee stuff, I know very little about. I don't know details, like a lot of detail. So this is interesting to me. It'll get into other stuff where I'll know a little bit more. But hey, I'm learning. Never really stop learning because you'll never really know the whole story. You'll never know the whole battle, every battle, all the details, all that stuff. I'm glitching and it's driving me crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Hope you enjoyed. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night.